The Wolf's Bride, a werewolf shifter romance audiobook. In a world where the elite wield power and secrets like weapons, Kala Arbor, a quiet seamstress, is thrust into a world she barely understands when she is claimed as the contract bride of Lucian Wolf, the enigmatic CEO of Wolf Enterprises. But Lucian is no ordinary man. He hides a feral, dangerous secret. He's a powerful alpha werewolf bound by ancient laws to take a mate. Kala struggles to navigate the ruthless world Lucian inhabits, where alliances are fragile, betrayals are commonplace, and danger lurks in the shadows. Yet beneath his cold exterior lies an undeniable primal pull that ties their fates together. As Lucian's dark obsession with her grows, Kala discovers the terrifying truth about his empire. And caught between fear and desire, Kala must decide if she will tame the wolf or risk being devoured by it. In a world where love is a weapon and trust is a gamble, will Kala find the courage to fight for her freedom or surrender to the mate who would claim her completely? Chapter 1. The sewing machine whirred, its steady rhythm filling the cramped workshop with a hum that matched the monotony of Kala's life. She sat hunched over the latest project, a disastrous chiffon gown that seemed to resist every attempt to tame its unruly fabric. Beads of sweat dotted her brow as she muttered under her breath, "Come on, you wretched thing, work with me here." Kala tugged at a puckering seam, only for the thread to snap with an audible ping. "Ah," she groaned, flinging the broken thread aside and glancing at the clock. 10:30. The dress was due by noon. Of course, she would come back to haunt her. As if summoned by Kala's thoughts, the workshop door slammed open, and a sharp nasal voice pierced the air. "Miss Arbor, tell me my gown is ready, or so help me." Victoria Lennox, the city's reigning socialite and self-opinioned goddess of fashion, stormed in like a hurricane in 6-inch heels. Her perfectly coiffed blonde hair bounced as she stopped short, her eyes narrowing at the mess of fabric sprawled on Kala's work table. Kala straightened, swallowing the lump of panic rising in her throat. "Good morning, Miss Lennox. I was just—" "Don't you good morning me," Victoria snapped, her manicured finger jabbing toward the unfinished dress. "That rag is supposed to be my showstopper tonight. What is this, a charity case for seamstresses who hate fabric?" Kala resisted the urge to rub her temples. "The chiffon—" "I don't care about the chiffon," Victoria interrupted, her voice rising to a pitch that made Kala's eardrums wince. "Fix it. Now." Behind Victoria, Kala caught sight of Marta, her employer, standing in the doorway with arms crossed. The stern lines of her face deepened as she surveyed the scene. Kala's heart sank. "Miss Lennox," Marta said smoothly, stepping forward with the grace of someone who thrived on diffusing disasters. "You know Kala's work is impeccable. She'll have it done in no time, won't you, Kala?" "Yes," Kala replied, her voice faltering. "Speak up, girl," Marta snapped, her smile tight as she turned back to Victoria. "You'll have the gown ready in 2 hours, or I'll see to it personally." Kala swallowed the sting of the reprimand, nodding stiffly. 2 hours. Victoria sniffed, flicking her hair over her shoulder. "Good, I'll be back, and it better not look like something off the clearance rack this time." With that, she pivoted on her heels and strutted out, her exit as dramatic as her entrance. Marta lingered, her cold gaze fixed on Kala. "I told you to keep the clients happy. Do I need to remind you that Lennox money keeps this shop afloat?" "No, Marta," Kala said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Good. Then act like it." Marta spun on her heel and left, the door swinging shut behind her. As silence settled over the room, Kala let out a long breath, slumping back into her chair. The chiffon gown stared back at her mockingly, its jagged seams a testament to the chaos of her morning. "Maybe I should have been a baker," she muttered, pulling out a fresh spool of thread. "Cupcakes don't yell at you." The workshop was a small, suffocating space, tucked between a bakery and a pawn shop in the city's lower district. The faint aroma of fresh bread wafted in through the open window, mingling with the ever-present scent of fabric dye and machine oil. Kala had lived and worked in this part of the city her entire life, her world confined to its narrow streets and flickering neon signs. She glanced at the sewing machine, its scuffed surface reflecting the dim overhead light. Her father had bought it for her when she was 17, back when she still believed she could turn her designs into something more than custom orders for spoiled elites. Now, at 24, her dreams of creating her own fashion line were buried beneath deadlines and demanding clients. The bell above the workshop door jingled, pulling her from her thoughts. She turned, expecting Victoria's wrathful return, but was met with a much gentler presence. "Kala, you look like you could use a coffee," Astra said, holding up 2 steaming cups. Her friend's bright smile was a welcome break from the storm clouds that had dominated the morning. "You're a lifesaver." Kala abandoned the gown and reached for the cup. "Rough day?" Astra asked, settling into a chair by the window. "Is there any other kind?" Kala blew on her coffee, savoring the warmth. "Victoria Lennox happened, so you can imagine how that went." Astra grimaced. Yikes. Did she bring her usual fire and brimstone routine? "With extra brimstone," Kala quipped, earning a laugh from Astra. "Ugh, if I didn't need this job." "You'd walk out and never look back," Astra finished, raising her cup. "Here's to dreams we can't afford to chase." They clinked cups in mock celebration, though the sentiment stung more than Kala cared to admit. "You know," Astra said after a sip, "you could still try. Go for your own line, get out of here and start fresh." Kala shook her head. "It's not that simple. Rent, bills, Marta breathing down my neck. It's a nice thought, but I'm stuck here." "Stuck is just a state of mind," Astra countered, her tone teasing. "You're better than this place, Kala. You just don't see it yet." The bell jingled again, cutting their conversation short. A young courier stepped in, holding a sleek black envelope that looked as out of place in the workshop as a diamond in a mud puddle. "Kala Arbor?" the courier asked. Kala exchanged a confused glance with Astra before raising her hand. "That's me." The courier crossed the room, handing her the envelope with a curt nod before disappearing back into the bustling street. "What's that?" Astra asked, leaning closer. "I have no idea." Kala turned the envelope over, her fingers brushing the embossed logo on the back. A wolf's head, elegant and predatory. Wolf Enterprises. Why would Wolf Enterprises be sending you something? Astra's eyes widened. "Your guess is as good as mine." Kala hesitated, her pulse quickening as she slid her finger beneath the seal and pulled out a crisp sheet of paper. The bold, minimalist font was as intimidating as the name at the bottom of the letter. She read aloud. "You are hereby summoned to a meeting at Wolf Enterprises headquarters tomorrow at 9 a.m. sharp. Please bring this letter as proof of identification." Astra whistled low. "Summoned? That sounds ominous." "No kidding." Kala reread the letter, her stomach twisting in knots. What could Wolf Enterprises want with her? "Maybe they're hiring?" Astra suggested. "Big company like that probably needs a ton of custom tailoring." "Or they're suing me," Kala muttered, her mind spinning with worst-case scenarios. "Don't be ridiculous. You've never even been near their ivory tower. Whatever it is, it could be a good thing." Kala folded the letter, tucking it back into the envelope. "I guess I'll find out tomorrow." As the sewing machine whirred back to life, the tension in her chest remained. Whatever Wolf Enterprises wanted, one thing was certain. It was about to turn her life upside down. The city's skyline loomed in the distance, a jagged crown of glass and steel that always seemed just out of reach. Kala craned her neck to take it all in as she stepped off the bus, clutching the black envelope against her chest like a talisman. Wolf Enterprises headquarters was impossible to miss. Its sleek, mirrored facade soared above the rest of the skyline, a monolith of power and wealth that didn't belong to people like her. She glanced at her reflection in the building's glass doors, Her blouse, though neatly pressed, looked embarrassingly plain compared to the parade of tailored suits and designer dresses sweeping past her. Her modest skirt felt too short, her flats too scuffed. "Great," she muttered under her breath, running a hand over her braid. "I'm a walking before picture." A security guard opened the door, his stoic expression unmoving as she hesitated. "Miss Arbor?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, startled. "Follow me." He didn't wait for confirmation before turning on his heel and heading inside. Kala stepped into the building, and her breath hitched. The lobby was a symphony of excess. Polished marble floors stretched endlessly, reflecting the opulent crystal chandeliers above. The air smelled faintly of leather and citrus, as if even the ambiance had a designer label. She felt as though she'd wandered onto the set of a movie where she was the painfully underdressed extra. With a swipe of his keycard, one of the doors slid open silently, revealing a private elevator lined with gold trim and black leather panels. "You're going to the top floor," he said. "Good luck." "Wait, what?" Kala blurted, but the doors closed before she could get another word in. The elevator hummed softly as it ascended, and Kala's pulse raced with it. She glanced down at the letter in her hand, rereading the elegant script for the 100th time. Why me? She wasn't anyone important. She wasn't rich, powerful, or remotely connected to this world. The elevator dinged, breaking her spiraling thoughts. The doors slid open to reveal a sprawling office that could only belong to someone who controlled the fate of the universe, or at least the city. The view was breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline, casting streams of light onto a sleek black desk that sat at the center of the room like a throne. The air was unnervingly still, punctuated only by the soft hum of hidden machinery. Kala stepped forward hesitantly, the sound of her flats tapping against the polished floor echoing in the cavernous space. "Miss Arbor." The voice sent a chill down her spine. Deep, smooth, and commanding, it came from a figure standing by the window. He turned slowly, and for a moment, Kala forgot how to breathe. Lucian Wolf. He looked as though he'd stepped out of a fashion magazine, his tailored suit clinging to his broad shoulders with surgical precision. Dark hair, sharp cheekbones, and piercing blue eyes that seemed to cut through her like glass. But there was something else about him, an aura of power that made her feel simultaneously drawn to and terrified of him. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," Lucian said, his lips curling into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Kala cleared her throat, fighting to find her voice. "I wasn't exactly given much of a choice." The corners of his mouth twitched, as though her response had mildly amused him. "Fair enough. Please, sit." He gestured to a leather chair across from his desk. Kala sank into it, feeling the weight of his gaze on her. She couldn't tell if it was curiosity or something else, but it made her skin prickle. "Do you know why you're here?" Lucian asked, settling into his own chair with the ease of someone who owned the world. "No," she said honestly. "The letter didn't exactly come with a lot of details." Lucian leaned back, steepling his fingers. "We've been watching you for some time, Miss Arbor." Her stomach flipped. "Watching me? Why?" "You're talented," he said simply. "Your work has caught the attention of people in my circle, and when I see potential, I don't let it go to waste." Kala blinked, caught between confusion and disbelief. "I'm sorry, but there must be some mistake. I'm just a seamstress." Lucien's smile widened, and this time it carried a hint of something predatory. "You're far more than that." The cryptic response sent a shiver down her spine, but before she could press further, Lucian stood abruptly. He crossed the room to a sleek side table, pouring himself a glass of water. "I believe in precision, Miss Arbor," he said, his tone casual yet deliberate. "In every thread, every seam, every detail. And I see that same precision in your work. It's rare and it's valuable." Thank you," Kala said, though her voice wavered. Lucian returned to his desk, setting the glass down with an unsettling finality. You're going to work for me." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. "What?" she managed, her voice higher than she'd intended. "I don't—" "You will," he interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "The terms will be generous, far beyond anything you're accustomed to, but in return I require loyalty and discretion." Kala's heart raced as she tried to process what was happening. "I don't understand. Why me? Why now?" Lucien's gaze softened, but only slightly. "Because, Miss Arbor, there's a storm coming, and you have a role to play in it, whether you're ready or not." The room seemed to tilt as his words sank in. Kala gripped the armrests of the chair, her pulse thundering in her ears. "I'll give you time to think it over," Lucien said, standing once more. "But not much. I'll expect your decision by the end of the week." Before she could respond, the doors behind her swung open, and the security guard from earlier stepped inside. "This way, Miss Arbor," he said. Kala rose on shaky legs, clutching the envelope like a lifeline. As she followed the guard out of the office, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just stepped into a world far more dangerous and far more intriguing than she could have ever imagined. The elevator doors closed, and Kala's reflection stared back at her, wide-eyed and disheveled. "Loyalty and discretion," she muttered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the elevator. "What the hell have I gotten myself into?" Chapter 2. Kala clutched the black envelope in one hand and the straps of her tote bag in the other, her knuckles whitening as the taxi cruised down the bustling city streets. She couldn't help glancing at the letter's embossed wolf emblem as if it might leap out and bite her. "You sure you're not heading to a job interview at a Bond villain's lair?" Astra's voice crackled through Kala's Bluetooth earpiece. "That's not helping," Kala muttered, her heart thudding against her ribs. "Oh, come on, and what's the worst that could happen? They want you to sew matching evil uniforms for their nefarious empire?" Astra chuckled, and Kala could almost hear smirking. "I wish it were that simple." "This is Wolf Enterprises, Astra. The kind summoned," Astra repeated, drawing out the word. Sounds ominous. Maybe they're vampires." Kala let out a groan. "Can we not add supernatural conspiracies to the list of reasons I might throw up before I get there? Fine, just breathe. And remember, if this guy gives off supervillain vibes, you call me. I'll stage a rescue with snacks and a crowbar." Kala laughed to spite herself. "Thanks, Astra. I'll let you know how it goes." The taxi rolled to a stop in front of Wolf Enterprises, and Kala's breath hitched. The building towered above her, its mirrored surface reflecting the overcast sky like a portal to another dimension. She stepped out, feeling very much like she'd wandered into a forbidden kingdom where mortals dared not tread. Inside, the air was cool and crisp, with the faintest hint of citrus and cedar? Kala blinked, momentarily distracted by the oddly soothing scent. The grandeur of the lobby hit her like a freight train. Polished marble floors, golden light fixtures, and a reception desk so long it could double as a runway. "Miss Arbor," a woman's voice called, cutting through her awe. Kala turned to see a statuesque brunette in a fitted blazer. Her hair was pulled into a sleek bun, and her expression could curdle milk. "I'm Vivian, Mr. Wolf's executive assistant. He's expecting you." Vivian's tone was clipped, her smile so brief it barely registered. Right, thanks," Kala said, clutching her bag like a shield. "Follow me." Vivian spun on her heel, her heels clicking against the floor like a metronome of doom. As they stepped into a private elevator, Kala's unease grew. Vivian swiped her badge, and the elevator began its smooth ascent. The numbers ticked higher and higher, but Kala's nerves sank lower with every passing second. "Relax, Miss Arbor," Vivian said without looking at her. "Mr. Wolf is very particular about his guests, but I'm sure he wouldn't have summoned you if you weren't." "Special?" "Special?" Kala echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. Vivian's lips twitched. "You'll see." The elevator dinged, and the doors opened to reveal a sprawling office that made Kala feel like she'd accidentally wandered into a billionaire's secret bunker. Floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the room in soft, natural light, and the sleek black desk at the center was flanked by shelves lined with books, art, and what looked suspiciously like a pair of antique daggers. "Mr. Wolf will see you now," Vivian said, gesturing toward the desk. Kala's pulse quickened as she stepped forward, the soft carpet swallowing the sound of her footsteps. A tall figure emerged from the shadows near the window, and Kala froze. Lucian Wolf. Her first thought was that he looked like trouble in a perfectly tailored suit. His dark hair framed a face that could make a sculptor weep, and his piercing blue eyes were so intense they seemed to cut straight through her. He moved with the kind of predatory grace that made her skin prickle, and yet she couldn't look away. "Miss Arbor?" he said, his voice low and smooth, like velvet laced with steel. "Thank you for coming." Kala cleared her throat, forcing herself to speak. "Well, it's not every day I get an invitation from one of the most powerful men in the city." Lucian's lips twitched, a faint smirk playing at the edges. "I suppose it's not." He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Please, sit." Kala hesitated for half a second before obeying, her tote bag perched awkwardly on her lap. Lucien took his own seat, steepling his fingers as he studied her with a gaze that was equal parts curious and assessing. "Do you know why you're here?" he asked, his tone unreadable. "No, actually," Kala admitted. "The letter was a little vague." Lucien leaned back in his chair, his smirk widening just enough to make her feel like the mouse facing the cat. "I prefer to keep things intriguing." "Oh, that's one way to describe it," she said before she could stop herself. His chuckle was low, almost dangerous. "I can see why you've caught my attention." Kala blinked, her cheeks heating. "I caught your attention? Why?" Lucian tilted his head, his gaze never wavering. "Let's just say you're uniquely suited for a very important role I have in mind." The room seemed to shrink around her, the air growing thicker with every word he spoke. "What kind of role?" "Something that will require your talents," he said, his tone as cryptic as ever. Kala's stomach twisted with unease. She couldn't decide if he was being deliberately mysterious or if he just enjoyed watching her squirm. "I think there's been a mistake," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm just a seamstress." Lucien leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "No, Miss Arbor, you're much more than that. You just don't know it yet." The words sent a shiver down her spine, though she couldn't tell if it was fear or something else entirely. Before she could respond, Lucien opened a drawer and pulled out a sleek leather folder. "This," he said, sliding it across the desk, "is your contract." Kala stared at the folder like it might explode. "My contract?" "Sign it," Lucian said, his voice soft but commanding, "and everything will change." The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Kala's fingers twitched as she reached for the folder, her heart pounding in her ears. "Change?" she echoed, her voice barely audible. Lucian's smirk returned, sharp and enigmatic. "Yes, in ways you can't even imagine." Kala's fingers hesitated over the sleek leather folder, her mind a chaotic swirl of questions, doubts, and a mounting sense of unease. She wasn't one to be easily spooked, but there was something about Lucian Wolf, his presence, his words, the way he seemed to look through her instead of at her, that set her nerves on edge. "What exactly am I signing up for?" she asked, forcing a steadiness into her voice that she didn't quite feel. Lucien leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable, though a flicker of amusement danced in his eyes. "A partnership, Miss Arbor. One that would be mutually beneficial." "Partnership?" Kala repeated, arching an eyebrow. "I think you have the wrong person. I'm not exactly in the partnering with billionaires league." Lucien chuckled softly, a low sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "That's what makes you perfect for this. You're untouched by the world I operate in." His choice of words was odd, almost intimate, and it made her stomach flip. "Well, that's cryptic," she said, trying to mask her nerves with humor. Do you always hire people without telling them what they're actually supposed to do? Only when it's necessary, Lucian replied smoothly. You'll find the details outlined in the contract. I assure you, it's nothing you're incapable of handling. Kala frowned, tapping her fingers against the edge of the desk. This was insane. Everything about this situation screamed run, but a stubborn part of her refused to back down. She wasn't going to let some overconfident CEO intimidate her into signing something without an explanation. Look, she said, leaning forward slightly. I don't know what kind of power trip you're on, but I'm not just going to scribble my name on some mysterious contract because you think I'm perfect for the job. I need details. Lucian's lips curved into a small smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. Fair enough. He rose from his chair, his movements fluid and deliberate, and strode to the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him. Kala watched as he stood there, his silhouette outlined by the city skyline. For a brief moment, the room felt charged, like the air before a thunderstorm. Wolf Enterprises deals in power, Lucian said, his voice carrying a strange resonance. Not just financial power, but influence, territory, legacy. He turned back to her, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. You're part of that legacy, Kala, whether you realize it or not. Her heart skipped a beat. What are you talking about? I'm just a seamstress. There's nothing special about me. You're wrong, Lucian said, his tone soft but unyielding. Your instincts, your precision, your resilience, they're all signs of something far greater. Something. Kala stared at him, her pulse pounding in her ears. She didn't know whether to laugh, argue, or bolt for the elevator. You're making it sound like I'm some chosen one in a fantasy novel. Lucian tilted his head, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. Perhaps not far off. Okay, she said, throwing up her hands. This is officially the weirdest job offer I've ever gotten. And I've had a customer ask me to sew matching outfits for her and her dog. Lucian chuckled again, but there was an edge to it this time, something almost predatory. The air between them seemed to thrum, and Kala's unease deepened. Why don't you just tell me what you really want? She demanded, folding her arms. Lucian's expression shifted, his amusement giving way to something more serious. He stepped closer, stopping just short of the desk, and Kala felt the weight of his presence like a tangible thing. I want to protect what's mine, he said, his voice low and charged. And whether you like it or not, Kala, you're part of that now. Her breath caught in her throat. The words were laced with an intensity that both terrified and fascinated her. You keep saying things like that, she said, her voice trembling despite her efforts to keep it steady. Like you know something I don't. Lucian leaned forward, his hands resting on the desk, his gaze never wavering. I do. For a moment the silence between them was deafening. Kala's thoughts raced, her instincts screaming at her to leave, but something about Lucian's presence, his confidence, his calm, the way he seemed so certain of her importance, kept her rooted in place. She broke the silence with a nervous laugh. Do you practice this? The whole mysterious billionaire with a secret routine? Because it's very convincing. Lucian's lips twitched into another faint smirk. I don't need to practice, Miss Arbor. And I think you know that. Kala's stomach flipped again, and she hated how easily he unsettled her. You know what? I think I need some time to... Before she could finish, Lucian reached across the desk and flipped open the folder, revealing the crisp pages of the contract inside. Time is a luxury we don't have, he said, his voice soft but firm. Read it, sign it, and trust me when I say you won't regret it. She glanced at the contract, then back at him. You're really not big on details, are you? Lucian straightened, his gaze softening just enough to make her pulse quicken. Some things can't be explained, Kala. They can only be experienced. Kala stared at him, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. Part of her wanted to walk out and never look back, but another part, a quieter, more curious part, wondered if this was the kind of moment that changed everything. Fine, she said finally, her voice sharper than she intended. But if this turns out to be some elaborate prank, I'm coming back with a pair of scissors. Lucien's smirk returned, this time with a hint of satisfaction. I wouldn't expect anything less. Her hand hovered over the pen, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She glanced up at Lucien one last time, hoping for some shred of reassurance, but his expression remained unreadable. With a deep breath, Kala picked up the pen and signed her name. As the ink dried, Lucien's smirk widened. "Welcome to Wolf Enterprises, Miss Arbor." The words sent a shiver down her spine, and for the first time she realized she might have just stepped into something far bigger and far more dangerous than she could have imagined. Chapter 3. The lock on Kala's apartment door stuck, as it always did, requiring an aggressive jiggle and a creative curse before it gave way with a metallic groan. She stumbled inside, her legs unsteady and her heart still racing from the surreal meeting with Lucian Wolf. Dropping her bag onto the rickety kitchen table, she let out a long breath, as if the air had been trapped in her lungs since she left Wolf Enterprises. The black folder felt heavier than it should as she placed it beside her bag, its sleek cover practically daring her to open it again. "What the hell just happened?" she muttered, rubbing her temples. Her apartment wasn't much cramped, with peeling wallpaper and a perpetually leaky faucet, but it was hers, a sanctuary of sorts. Except now, even the dingy familiarity of the place couldn't shake the lingering effect of Lucian Wolf's presence. She paced the room, her thoughts spiraling. This is insane. This can't be real. I'm not some chosen one or whatever he thinks I am. I'm just me, Kala, the seamstress who can't even afford a decent coffee machine. Her eyes darted to the contract again. The terms Lucian had mentioned echoed in her mind. Generous. Barely scratched the surface. A paycheck like that could solve a lot of problems. She wouldn't have to deal with Marta's constant condescension or scramble to make rent each month. She could finally breathe. But there was something else, too. Something about Lucian's gaze, the way his words wrapped around her like a promise and a warning, sent a shiver through her. No amount of money could erase the feeling that she was walking into a lion's den. Her phone buzzed on the counter, snapping her out of her thoughts. Astra's name lit up the screen. "Perfect timing," Kala muttered, swiping to answer. "Okay, spill," Astra demanded without preamble. "What happened? Is he a vampire? A secret alien overlord? Did he ask you to join a cult?" Kala laughed despite herself, the sound shaky. "Not quite, but it's close. I don't even know how to explain it, Astra. He offered me a job. Or something. A partnership, he called it." "Partnership? With Wolf Enterprises?" Astra's voice climbed an octave. "Kala, are you serious? That place is like a fortress for the 1% of the 1%. What does he want with you?" "That's the thing," Kala said, slumping into the lumpy couch. "He wouldn't say. He just kept talking in riddles about how I'm perfect for the role, like he knows something I don't." Astra groaned. Men and their cryptic power moves. Did he at least explain what this role is? "Not really. He gave me a contract, said to think it over." Kala glanced at the black folder, its polished surface gleaming under the dim light. "But," Astra asked, "he's not normal. There's something about him, something—" She searched for the right word. "Intense. Like he's dangerous, but also—" "Huh?" Astra offered. Kala rolled her eyes, though her cheeks warmed. "That's not the point." Sure. Okay, so Mr. Dark and Mysterious wants you to join his empire." "Kala, this screams red flag." "I know," Kala said softly, biting her lip. Astra's tone softened. "Look, I get it. You're overwhelmed, and it sounds like the paycheck could be life-changing. But if it feels wrong, trust your gut. There's no amount of money worth getting wrapped up in something shady." Kala sighed, the weight of Astra's words settling over her. She wanted to believe it was that simple, but the thought of returning to the suffocating grind of her current life made her chest tighten. "Just promise me you'll be careful," Astra added. "And don't sign anything until we've dissected it with a magnifying glass and a lawyer." Kala managed a weak laugh. "Deal." After they hung up, the apartment felt quieter. heavier. Kala's gaze drifted to the contract again, her fingers twitching with the urge to open it. She needed clarity, something to make sense of the chaos swirling in her mind. Instead, she grabbed a blanket and wrapped herself in it, sinking into the couch as if it could shield her from the world. But even as she closed her eyes, she couldn't shake the feeling that Lucian Wolf's shadow was still looming over her. Meanwhile, Lucian stood on the balcony of his penthouse, his gaze fixed on the city lights sprawling below. From up here, everything seemed so small, so distant, yet his thoughts were anything but detached. "She's intriguing," he murmured, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Dangerously so," a voice said from behind him. Rowan stepped into the dim light of the balcony, his expression unreadable as usual. "You sure about this, Lucian? Bringing someone like her into the fold, it's a risk." "Every move worth making is a risk," Lucian replied, his tone calm but firm. "She's different, Rowan. You saw it too, didn't you?" Rowan crossed his arms, his amber eyes narrowing. "What I saw is someone who doesn't know what she's walking into. If you push too hard, she'll bolt." Lucian's smirk was slow, predatory. "She won't. She's stronger than she realizes, and when the time comes, she'll choose the right path." "You sound awfully confident for someone who's betting on a human," Rowan said, his tone dry. Lucien's gaze darkened, a flicker of something primal surfacing in his expression. "She's not just human." Rowan arched an eyebrow but didn't press further. He knew better than to challenge Lucian when his mind was set. Instead, he shifted the topic. "The pack's restless. They're not going to like this." "They'll adapt," Lucian said simply, turning back to the skyline. "Kala is essential. They'll understand soon enough." Rowan's silence lingered like a warning, but Lucian ignored it. His focus was elsewhere, fixed on the thread of fate that had brought Kala into his orbit. She had no idea what she was stepping into, but Lucian did, and he wouldn't let her slip away. Not now, not ever. The next morning, Kala sat at her kitchen table, staring down the black folder as if it might suddenly open and start dictating her future. The remnants of her hastily scarfed toast sat on the plate next to her, abandoned in favor of pacing the room. The events of the day before felt like a dream or a nightmare, depending on which minute she thought about it. The contract was still unopened, and she'd barely slept, her mind spinning with all the reasons to say no and a few terrifying reasons to say yes. Her phone buzzed, breaking the quiet. She snatched it up, hoping for another pep talk from Astra, but her stomach dropped when she saw the name on the screen. "Marta." "Great," she muttered, before reluctantly answering. "Hello?" "Arbor," Marta snapped, her tone sharper than usual. "I need you in the shop today. The Lennox order is a disaster, and we can't afford another mistake with her, understand?" Kala pinched the bridge of her nose. "I thought Victoria was happy with the last—" "She's not," Marta interrupted. "And if we lose her as a client, don't bother coming back tomorrow." Kala's stomach churned. "I'll be there," she said, her voice flat. Marta hung up without another word, and Kala dropped the phone onto the table. Her financial reality came crashing down like a tidal wave. Rent was due in a week, her savings account was practically empty, and now her job hung by a thread. Literally. She glanced at the black folder again, its sleek surface practically gleaming with temptation. "What if it's not as bad as it seems?" she murmured to herself. Before she could spiral further, a knock at the door startled her. Kala froze. No one knocked on her door, especially not before noon. She tiptoed to the peephole, her heart racing. Through the tiny glass circle, she saw a man in a crisp gray suit holding a package. "Miss Arbor?" the man called, his tone professional but loud enough to make her flinch. "To delivery from Wolf Enterprises?" Her mouth fell open. Of course! Because this situation wasn't bizarre enough already. After a moment of internal debate, she unlocked the door and opened it just enough to peek out. The man handed her a black box tied with a silver ribbon, nodded politely, and walked away without waiting for a signature. "Okay, that's not ominous," she muttered, carrying the box back to the kitchen. She set it on the table and untied the ribbon, her hands trembling slightly. Inside, nestled in black tissue paper, was a sleek laptop with the Wolf Enterprises logo embossed on its lid. Kala blinked. "What the hell?" Beneath the laptop was a note, written in the same elegant handwriting as the letter. Zabul. Consider this a tool for the journey ahead. The choice is still yours, but time is fleeting. Tilde Lucian Wolf. Kala slumped into the chair, staring at the note. The words felt heavy, like they carried more meaning than they should. "Oh, for crying out loud," she muttered, tossing the note aside. "Who is this guy?" Her phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Astra. "Did you make a decision yet? If not, I'm coming over with donuts and a list of reasons why this is probably a bad idea." "Kala, I wish I had answers. He sent me a laptop." "A laptop? Who does that?" Astra. Rich, controlling men with questionable motives. "Tell me there wasn't a contract in there too." Kala stared at the unopened contract on her table. "Kala, there is. I haven't signed it." Astra. "Good, don't. I'm serious, Kala. This guy could have a dozen hidden agendas and you wouldn't know until it's too late." Kala sighed, setting the phone down. Astra wasn't wrong, but with each passing minute, the pressure mounted. Between Marta's threats, her dwindling bank account, and Lucian's unrelenting presence, she felt like the walls were closing in. She stood abruptly, grabbed the black folder, and shoved it into her tote bag. "Enough," she said aloud, more to herself than anyone else. "I need answers." Meanwhile, Lucian stood in his office, gazing at the skyline with his hands clasped behind his back. His phone buzzed on the desk and without turning, he answered it. "Report," he said curtly. "She received the delivery," Vivian's voice replied on the other end. "But she hasn't signed yet." Lucian's lips curved into a faint smirk. "She's stubborn. Good." "Are you sure this is the right approach?" Vivian asked, a note of hesitation in her voice. "If she feels cornered, she might—" "She won't," Lucian interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Kala isn't like the others. She needs to choose, yes, but she also needs to understand the stakes. She's not running from this." Vivian was silent for a moment before responding. "And if she does?" Lucian's expression darkened, his eyes glinting with a predatory edge. "Then she'll leave me no choice." Kala burst through the doors of Wolf Enterprises later that afternoon, her tote bag slung over one shoulder and determination burning in her chest. The receptionist blinked in surprise as Kala marched to the desk. "I need to see Lucian Wolf," she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "Do you have an appointment?" the receptionist asked, her tone polite but skeptical. "No, but he's expecting me," Kala replied. The receptionist hesitated, then picked up the phone. Moments later, she gestured toward the private elevator. Kala stepped inside, the doors closing around her like the jaws of a trap. Her reflection stared back at her, wide-eyed but resolute. When the elevator doors slid open, Lucian was waiting, his posture relaxed but his gaze sharp. "Ms. Arbor," he said, his voice smooth as ever. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Kala stepped forward, dropping her bag onto his desk with a thud. "We need to talk." Lucian arched an eyebrow, clearly amused. "About this," she said, pulling out the contract. "The job, the cryptic messages, the laptop. Whatever game you're playing, I'm not interested." Lucian's smirk widened, and the air in the room seemed to shift, growing heavier. He stepped closer, his movements unhurried but deliberate. "Miss Arbor," he said softly, his gaze locking onto hers. "I don't think you understand. This isn't a game. And whether you like it or not, you don't have a choice anymore." The weight of his words settled over her, and for the first time, Kala realized just how deep she was in. Chapter 4. The room felt smaller than it should have, despite its sprawling windows and ceilings that soared toward the heavens. Kala's heartbeat echoed in her ears as she stared at Lucian, his piercing blue eyes fixed on her with unsettling calm. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice higher than she intended. Lucian's smirk deepened, the sharpness of it making her insides twist. "I said the contract isn't just a job offer, Miss Arbor. It's a commitment, a binding one." "Binding?" Her laugh was sharp, brittle. "What, like a blood pact? I hope you're joking, because I didn't exactly bring a sacrificial goat to this meeting." His expression didn't waver. If anything, it softened, which somehow made it worse. "No blood required, just your signature." The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Kala glanced at the contract still spread out on his desk, the neatly typed paragraphs suddenly looking like lines in a trap. "Okay," she said slowly, trying to keep her voice from shaking. "This isn't funny anymore. If this is some weird power move to scare me into taking the job, congratulations. You win. I'm terrified. But I'm also leaving." She turned toward the door, but Lucian's voice stopped her cold. "You won't get far." There was no malice in his tone, just quiet certainty, and that somehow made it worse. She spun back around to face him. "Excuse me." Lucian stepped closer, his movements unhurried but deliberate, like a predator closing in on prey. The air seemed to shift around him, heavy with something Kala couldn't name. "This isn't just about a job," he said, his voice low and steady. "It's about protection, stability, power. I can give you all of that, Kala, but only if you're willing to trust me." "Trust you?" she said, her voice rising. "I don't even know you." Lucian tilted his head, studying her with a gaze that felt far too intimate. "Not yet. But you will." Her stomach churned, a mix of fear and frustration bubbling to the surface. "You keep saying things like that, like you already know how this ends. Well, newsflash, Mr. Wolf, I don't. And right now, it's looking a lot like I'm walking into a bad episode of Dateline." He chuckled softly, the sound rumbling in his chest. "You're sharper than I expected. Good. You'll need that." "For what?" she demanded, throwing her hands up. Lucian's smile faded, replaced by something darker, more serious. He took another step forward, and Kala instinctively backed up until she hit the edge of the desk. "For survival," he said simply. Kala stared at him, her mind racing. "You're insane," she said, though her voice wavered. Lucian didn't flinch. Instead, he placed a hand on the contract, his long fingers tapping the edge. "You think this is a choice, but it's not. It never was." The calm finality in his tone sent a chill down her spine. "That's not how this works. You don't just decide someone's life for them." Lucian's lips twitched, not quite a smile but close enough to make her uneasy. "You'd be surprised how much I've already decided." "Stop talking in riddles and just tell me what you want," she snapped. Lucian's gaze softened, though the intensity behind it never wavered. "I want you to be safe, to be protected, and to do that you need to be here, with me." Her laugh came out bitter and shaky. "Oh, is that all? You just want to keep me in your shiny ivory tower for my own good?" "Please." Lucian leaned forward, his proximity making her heart race for all the wrong reasons. "You're in danger, Kala. Whether you believe me or not, there are people who would use you, harm you, for what you are." "Say I am," she repeated, her voice cracking. He straightened, his expression unreadable. "There's more to you than you know, but you'll learn, in time." She stared at him, her mind spinning. "This is insane. I should call the cops. Or a therapist. Or both." Lucian's smirk returned, sharper this time. "And tell them what? That a billionaire wants to keep you safe? I'm sure that'll go over well." She hated that he was right. She hated that part of her. Even a tiny, stubborn part believed him. "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucian stepped back, giving her just enough space to breathe. "Because you're mine." Her stomach dropped. "Excuse me?" "You don't see it yet, but you will," he said, his voice soft but unyielding. "You're part of my world now, Kala, and I protect what's mine." "Yours?" she repeated, anger flaring. "I'm not a possession, Lucian." "Of course not," he said, his smirk softening. "But you are important. To me. To this." He gestured vaguely, as if the weight of his words were too big for the room. Kala's hands curled into fists. She wanted to scream, to argue, to fight. But every word he spoke felt like a door slamming shut, leaving her with nowhere to run. A sharp knock at the door broke the tension. "Enter!" Lucian called, his voice calm again. The door opened and a man stepped in, tall, broad-shouldered, with amber eyes that practically glowed in the dim light. Kala blinked, startled by how effortlessly intimidating he was. "Rowan," Lucian said, inclining his head. "Good timing." The man, Rowan, gave a curt nod before turning his gaze to Kala. His expression was neutral, but something about the way he looked at her felt curious, like she was a puzzle he hadn't figured out yet. "This her?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. Kala bristled. "I have a name, you know." Rowan arched an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Feisty. Interesting choice, Lucian." Lucian smirked. "I thought so." Kala's patience snapped. "Okay, enough with the cryptic stares and the vague threats. If you want me to sign this ridiculous contract, you're going to tell me everything, right now." Rowan exchanged a glance with Lucian, who nodded slightly. "Fine," Lucian said, his tone shifting. "But once you know, there's no going back." Kala crossed her arms. "Try me." Lucian stepped closer, his gaze locking onto hers. "You're not just a seamstress, Kala. You're part of something much bigger, something ancient, and whether you like it or not, your place is here, with me." Her breath hitched. "Why? What makes me so special?" Lucian hesitated, just for a moment before answering. "Because you're connected to this world in ways you don't yet understand. And because without you, I can't protect what matters most." The weight of his words pressed down on her, suffocating and undeniable. She wanted to argue, to scream, to tell him he was wrong, but the look in his eyes stopped her. It wasn't just confidence. It was certainty. Lucian slid the contract toward her again, his voice soft but commanding. "Sign it, Kala, and let me keep you safe." Her hands trembled as she picked up the pen. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to fight, to do anything but give in. But somewhere deep down, a voice whispered that this wasn't just about her anymore. With a shaky breath, she signed her name. Lucian's smirk widened, but his gaze held something else. Satisfaction, yes, but also something darker. "Welcome to my world, Miss Arbor," he said, his voice laced with promise. Kala set the pen down, her chest tightening as the reality of her decision sank in. Whatever she'd just agreed to, she knew one thing for certain: there was no turning back. Chapter 5. Kala clutched her overnight bag like a lifeline as the sleek black SUV glided through the wrought iron gates of Lucian's estate. She had known he was rich. Billionaire, remember? But nothing could have prepared her for this. The sprawling mansion looked like it had been plucked from the pages of Architectural Digest, all glass, stone, and modern elegance. Perfectly manicured gardens surrounded the property, complete with fountains that seemed designed solely to make her feel underdressed in her clearance track jeans and scuffed sneakers. "Wow," Kala muttered, her voice laced with awe and unease. "Intimidating, isn't it?" Lucian's deep voice cut through her thoughts, and she glanced at him. He sat beside her, his posture relaxed, but his sharp blue eyes were anything but. "Understatement of the century," she quipped, though her voice wavered. Lucian's lips curved into that maddeningly enigmatic smirk. "You'll get used to it." "Doubtful," she muttered under her breath, but he heard her anyway. The faint chuckle that followed didn't help her nerves. The SUV rolled to a stop in front of the estate's grand entrance, where a small army of staff waited. Kala shrank into her seat as a tall man in a crisp suit opened her door. "Miss Arbor," he said with a polite bow. "Welcome." Thanks," she said awkwardly, stepping out onto the stone driveway. Lucian exited on the other side, his commanding presence immediately drawing the staff's attention. With a single nod, he dismissed them, leaving only one man standing beside him, a striking figure with amber eyes and an expression so neutral it bordered on cold. "Kala, this is Rowan," Lucian said, gesturing to the man. "My second in command." "Hi," she said, offering a small wave. Rowan didn't return it. "Miss Arbor," he said, his deep voice cool and measured. Kala's unease deepened. Rowan was handsome in an intimidating way. Tall and broad-shouldered, with short dark hair and a faint scar running across one eyebrow. He looked like someone who had seen things, and she wasn't sure she wanted to know what they were. "Rowan, we'll help you get settled," Lucian said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Kala blinked. "Wait, what? You're not going to show me around yourself?" "I have business to attend to," Lucian said smoothly. "Rowan is more than capable." Before she could protest, Lucian turned and strode toward the house, leaving her standing awkwardly beside Rowan. "Great," she muttered. The inside of the estate was as overwhelming as the outside. High ceilings, marble floors, and floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the space with natural light made the place feel more like a gallery than a home. Every surface gleamed, every detail screamed luxury, and every step Kala took made her feel like an imposter. "This way," Rowan said curtly, leading her up a grand staircase. Kala followed, her sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. "So, do you guys get a lot of visitors, or am I the lucky winner?" Rowan didn't so much as glance back. "You're the first." "First?" she repeated, her brow furrowing. "You mean Lucian doesn't usually bring people here?" Rowan stopped at the top of the stairs, turning to face her. His amber eyes bored into hers, and she fought the urge to take a step back. "Lucian doesn't trust easily," he said, his tone clipped. "If you're here, it's for a reason. Don't forget that." "Wow, thanks for the warm welcome," she shot back, though her bravado felt thin under his piercing gaze. Rowan's expression didn't change, and he turned without another word, leading her down a long hallway. Her assigned room was larger than her entire apartment. The king-sized bed was draped in pristine white linens, and the sitting area by the window offered a breathtaking view of the gardens. Kala set her bag down, feeling absurdly out of place. "This will be your room," Rowan said. "If you need anything, use the intercom." "Right. Thanks," she said, unsure if she meant it. Rowan lingered for a moment, his sharp gaze flicking over her as if assessing something. Then, without a word, he left, closing the door behind him. Kala let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding and flopped onto the bed. "This is insane," she muttered, staring at the ornate ceiling. "What am I even doing here?" The rest of the day passed in a blur of awkward encounters with staff who treated her like a porcelain doll, and the suffocating sense that she didn't belong. By dinner, she was ready to crawl out of her skin. The dining room was just as intimidating as the rest of the estate. A long table stretched across the room, though only 2 places were set, one at each end. Lucian was already seated, his sharp suit exchanged for a casual button-down that somehow made him look even more infuriatingly attractive. "Enjoying your stay so far?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "It's overwhelming," she admitted, sitting down across from him. "You'll adjust," he said simply. Kala bristled. "You keep saying that like it's inevitable." "Because it is." The certainty in his voice made her stomach twist. After dinner, Kala wandered the halls, needing space to clear her head. She stopped in front of a large window overlooking the gardens, the moonlight casting the flowers in a silvery glow. "This place is a prison," she muttered. "Funny," a voice said behind her, making her jump. She turned to see Rowan leaning against the wall, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. "Are you always lurking, or is it just me?" she asked, her voice tinged with annoyance. Rowan smirked, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Just keeping an eye on things, right?" she said, rolling her eyes. "Because I'm such a threat." Rowan's smirk faded, replaced by a seriousness that made her uneasy. You don't understand what you've stepped into, Kala. None of this is a coincidence. Her brow furrowed. What are you talking about? Before he could answer, a sharp voice interrupted. Rowan, Lucian said, his tone a command. Rowan straightened, his expression unreadable. Alpha. Kala's gaze darted between them, her confusion deepening. Alpha? Lucian ignored her, his sharp eyes locked on Rowan. A word! Rowan nodded and followed Lucian down the hall, leaving Kala standing alone. Curiosity got the better of her, and she crept after them, keeping to the shadows. She stopped outside a half-open door, straining to hear their voices. She's not ready, Rowan said, his voice low but firm. She doesn't need to be, Lucian replied. She'll learn. Rowan hesitated. And if she doesn't? Lucian's tone turned cold. Then she won't survive. Kala's breath caught, her pulse racing. What the hell have I gotten myself into? She whispered, her unease deepening as she slipped away unnoticed. Chapter 6. Kala's pulse thundered in her ears as she pressed herself against the wall outside Lucian's study, her breath shallow and quiet. She knew it was a terrible idea to eavesdrop, but after last night's cryptic conversation between Lucian and Rowan, her curiosity burned hotter than her sense of self-preservation. Inside, their voices were low but intense, and every word felt like a jigsaw piece to a puzzle she hadn't asked to solve. She's adjusting too slowly, Rowan said, his tone laced with disapproval. We don't have time for this, Lucian. She'll adapt, Lucian replied, calm but firm. Kala is stronger than you give her credit for. You're gambling with the pack, Rowan snapped. If she can't handle the truth— Enough, Lucian said sharply, the single word brimming with authority. I decide what risks to take. Kala leaned closer, her heart pounding. The pack? What truth? And why did she feel like the answer was going to make her regret not running for the hills the moment she signed that stupid contract? The door creaked open suddenly, and Rowan stepped out, his amber eyes immediately locking onto her. What are you doing here? He demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Kala's mouth opened, but no words came out. Before she could stammer a reply, Lucian appeared in the doorway behind him. Rowan, Lucian said, his voice like ice. Leave us. Rowan hesitated, his gaze flicking between them before he nodded curtly and disappeared down the hall. Inside, Lucian said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Kala swallowed hard and stepped into the study, the heavy door clicking shut behind her. Lucian stood by the desk, his sharp blue eyes cutting through her like a blade. You were eavesdropping, he said, not a question, but a statement. Kala folded her arms, trying to summon some semblance of confidence. You're not exactly forthcoming with information, so yeah, I was. Sue me. Lucian's smirk was cold and dangerous, sending a shiver down her spine. You have no idea what you're meddling in. Then explain it to me, she shot back. Because right now, all I know is that I've been dragged into something that makes zero sense and no one will tell me why. Lucian studied her for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. Then he sighed, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. You're not ready for the full truth. Kala bristled. Try me. You won't like it. I already don't like any of this, so what's one more thing? His lips twitched, almost as if he wanted to smile but didn't. Stubborn. Another reason you'll survive. Kala blinked. What does that mean? Before Lucian could answer, a low growl echoed from somewhere outside the room. Kala froze, her skin prickling as the sound vibrated through the air. What was that? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucian's expression darkened. Stay here. Like hell I will. Kala followed him as he strode to the door, her fear momentarily drowned out by anger. Lucian shot her a warning look. Kala, don't. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the distinct sound of something heavy crashing. Lucian muttered a curse under his breath and stepped into the hall. Kala trailed behind him. Despite the icy glare he shot her way, the commotion led them to a large sitting room where a man, if you could call him that, stood in the wreckage of a shattered coffee table. His chest heaved, and his amber eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, his form trembling as though barely holding itself together. "Ezekiel," Lucian said, his voice sharp. "Stand down." The man, "Kuf," Ezekiel snarled, his teeth elongating into sharp points. Kala stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. "What the hell?" she whispered. Lucian stepped between her and Ezekiel, his posture calm but brimming with authority. "I said, stand down," Ezekiel growled again. But after a tense moment, he dropped to one knee, his head bowed. "Forgive me, Alpha," he said, his voice rough and guttural. "Alpha?" Kala's head spun as the pieces started falling into place. Lucian nodded, his tone firm but not unkind. "Control yourself. You're no use to me like this." Ezekiel rose shakily, his form beginning to steady, though his glowing eyes lingered on Kala for a moment too long. Lucian's voice dropped, dangerously low. "Eyes off her." Ezekiel flinched and left without another word, disappearing down the hall. Kala turned to Lucian, her legs trembling beneath her. "What was that?" Lucian's gaze softened slightly, though the tension in his posture remained. "I warned you, Kala. You're not ready for this." "Oh, you dare," she snapped, anger flaring despite her fear. "I just saw a man turn into whatever that was. You owe me an explanation." Lucian sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "He's a werewolf, part of my pack." The words hung in the air, absurd and impossible, yet undeniable after what she'd just witnessed. Callan laughed, the sound high and hysterical. "Oh, sure. Werewolves, of course. Why not?" Lucien stepped closer, his expression calm but unyielding. "This is my world, Kala. The one you've been brought into, the one I've sworn to protect." She backed away, her chest tightening. Nope, this is too much. I'm out." "Kala?" "No," she interrupted, her voice shaking. "I didn't sign up for this. I can't." Lucien's eyes darkened, his presence filling the room. "You can't leave. Watch me." She turned and bolted, her feet pounding against the polished floors as she raced toward the front door. Her breath came in ragged gasps, panic clawing at her chest. She reached the door, fumbling with the lock, but before she could open it, Lucian was there. "Let me go," she shouted, spinning to face him. His gaze was sharper now, the blue of his eyes flickering with a strange, otherworldly glow. "You can't run from this, Kala." Her back hit the door as he stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "I didn't ask for this." "I didn't ask for you," he said softly, his voice a mix of anger and something deeper. "But here we are." The air around them seemed to thrum, heavy and electric. Lucien's jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists as if he was holding something back. "You're mine now, Kala," he said, his voice low and filled with a raw primal intensity. "There's no going back." For a brief, terrifying moment, his teeth elongated, sharp and predatory, and the faintest growl rumbled in his chest. Kala's breath hitched, her fear mingling with something she couldn't quite name. She didn't know whether to scream, cry, or faint, but one thing was certain: her life would never be the same. Chapter 7. Kala wasn't sure what she expected when Lucian told her they'd be introducing her to the pack, but this certainly wasn't it. She stood awkwardly in the middle of the estate's vast great room, feeling very much like a rabbit surrounded by wolves. Literal ones, she reminded herself. Lucian's pack members filled the space, their presence commanding and frankly intimidating. They moved with a fluidity that made her hyper-aware of her own clumsiness, their sharp gazes assessing her in ways that made her want to bolt for the nearest exit. "Relax," Lucian said softly, standing close enough that his presence felt like a shield against the weight of all those eyes. "Easy for you to say," Callie muttered, her voice barely audible over the hum of low conversation. "You're not the one being scrutinized like a bug under a microscope. You're stronger than you think," he replied, his tone carrying a note of finality that left no room for argument. She wasn't sure whether to thank him or smack him. The first to approach was Rowan, of course. He seemed to have a knack for making her feel unsettled, and today was no exception. "Alpha?" he said, nodding to Lucian before turning his sharp gaze on Kala. "Miss Arbor, Rowan," she replied, her tone attempting cordiality, but landing closer to sarcasm. "You're handling this better than I expected," he said, his words carefully measured but lacking warmth. "Gee, thanks," Kala said, folding her arms. "That's exactly the confidence boost I needed." Rowan's lips twitched, but the almost smile didn't reach his eyes. "Let's hope your resilience matches your wit." "Rowan," Lucian said warningly, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. Rowan stepped back, his expression unreadable, but not before Kala caught the faintest flicker of doubt, or was it curiosity, in his eyes. If Rowan was a cold front, Lucian Wolf was a full-blown blizzard. Lucian's sister swept into the room like she owned it, her platinum blonde hair gleaming under the soft light, and her tailored black outfit clinging to her tall, willowy frame. Kala instantly disliked her, which was convenient since the feeling appeared to be mutual. "So," Marceline said, her voice dripping with disdain as her sharp gray eyes raked over Kala, "This be the girl causing all the fuss?" "Marceline," Lucian said, his voice carrying a note of warning. "What?" she said innocently, though her smirk said otherwise. "I'm just saying it's surprising. She's so—" Marceline gestured vaguely at Kala, as though the mere act of existing was an insult. "Human?" Kala offered, her voice sharper than she intended. Marceline's smirk widened. "Delicate." Kala bristled but forced herself to stay calm. "You know, for someone who clearly shops in the Cruella de Vil section, you're awfully judgmental." Lucian's lips twitched, but Marceline's icy smile remained firmly in place. "Charming," she said, though the word sounded more like a dismissal. "I'm sure this will go splendidly." With that, she turned on her heel and swept away, leaving Kala feeling like she'd been hit by a frosty hurricane. "Well, she's delightful," Kala muttered. Lucian smirked. "Don't take it personally. Marceline's like that with everyone. There's handouts like that." As the introductions continued, Kala couldn't help but notice the unspoken hierarchy within the pack, the way they deferred to Lucian with quiet respect, or, in some cases, open fear, spoke volumes about his authority. But it also made her painfully aware of her own position. She wasn't just an outsider, she was a wild card, an anomaly in their tightly woven structure. Whispers followed her as she moved through the room, snippets of conversation barely audible but impossible to ignore. "She doesn't belong here. What does the alpha see in her? She'll be a liability." Kala clenched her fists, her frustration bubbling under the surface. She'd never asked to be part of this world, but now that she was here, she wasn't going to let them push her around. By the time the gathering ended, Kala was emotionally exhausted. Lucian led her to a smaller sitting room, his expression unreadable as he closed the door behind them. "That went well," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm as she collapsed onto a plush sofa. Lucian raised an eyebrow. Considering the circumstances, it could have been worse. "Oh, good," she said, throwing up her hands. "We've officially set the bar at could have been worse." He smirked, taking a seat across from her. "You handled yourself well. Most people wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes in that room." "Yeah, well, I've had plenty of practice dealing with difficult people," she said. "It's called working retail." Lucian chuckled softly, the sound low and unexpected. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Kala." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, and she didn't know how to respond. As the evening wore on, Kala tried to make sense of her new reality. The pack, the hierarchy, the constant tension, it was all so far removed from the life she'd known. But one thing was clear, Lucian's world was dangerous, and she was in way over her head. Later that night, as she wandered the estate, she overheard voices coming from Lucien's office. The door was ajar and she hesitated, torn between curiosity and self-preservation. "You know this won't be easy," Rowan said, his voice low but insistent. "I didn't expect it to be," Lucian replied, "but she's essential. You know that as well as I do." "She's not ready," Rowan said. "And if she falters—" "She won't," Lucian interrupted, his tone carrying a dangerous edge. Rowan sighed. "I hope you're right, because if you're wrong, it's not just her life at stake." Kala's breath caught, her stomach twisting with unease. She stepped back, careful not to make a sound, and retreated to her room. Whatever Lucian and Rowan were planning, it was clear she was at the center of it. And that terrified her. Chapter 8. Kala stared at the fire pit blazing in the center of the pack's outdoor gathering space, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The evening air was sharp and crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine, smoke, and something she couldn't quite place, something wild. She couldn't believe she was here. Scratch that. She couldn't believe any of this. "You're sulking," Lucian said, stepping up beside her. Kala shot him a glare. "I am not sulking. I'm contemplating." Lucian raised an eyebrow, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Contemplating what?" "Whether or not I'll survive the night," she said flatly. "You'll be fine," he said with maddening confidence. "You keep saying that, and yet, here I am, surrounded by people who'd probably love to see me trip into that fire." She gestured toward the glowing flames. "They'll come around," Lucian said, his tone softening. "But first, you need to prove you belong." Kala groaned. "Can't I just get a t-shirt that says I'm trying okay and call it a day?" Lucian's low chuckle sent a shiver down her spine. "I'm afraid it doesn't work like that." Of course it didn't, because nothing about this world, this pack, these people, was easy. The first ritual of the evening was something Rowan called the marking, which sounded ominous enough to make Kala wish she'd stayed in bed. "It's symbolic," Rowan explained as the pack members began to gather, "an acknowledgement of your place within the pack." "And if I don't want a place within the pack?" Kala asked, her voice tinged with sarcasm. "Then you're wasting everyone's time," Marceline said, appearing like a frosty shadow at Kala's side. Kala resisted the urge to roll her eyes. "You're just a ray of sunshine, aren't you?" "Careful," Marceline said, her tone icy. "You might be Lucian's little project, but that doesn't mean you're untouchable." "Marceline," Lucian's voice cut through the tension like a blade. He stepped forward, his presence commanding enough to make Marceline's smirk falter. "Just offering some friendly advice," Marceline said sweetly before sauntering off. Kala exhaled sharply, feeling her frustration mount. "How do you stand her?" Lucian's smirk returned. "She's loyal, and she's not wrong. You'll need to stand your ground." "Great, because that's been working so well for me," Kala muttered. The ritual began with a circle of pack members forming around the fire pit, their gazes sharp and expectant. Kala stood in the center, trying to look less like a deer in headlights and more like someone who had some semblance of control over her life. Rowan stepped forward, holding a bowl filled with what looked like a mixture of herbs and ash. "You'll speak your name and pledge your loyalty to the Alpha," he said, his tone as unyielding as ever. Kala raised an eyebrow. "That's it? No blood sacrifices?" "Not tonight," Rowan replied dryly, earning a few chuckles from the crowd. She glanced at Lucian, who gave her an encouraging nod. Her pulse quickened as all eyes turned to her. This was it, her moment to prove she wasn't just some outsider fumbling her way through their world. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. "I'm Kala Arbor," she said, her voice steady despite the nerves twisting in her stomach, "and I pledge my loyalty to the Alpha." The words felt strange in her mouth, but as soon as she spoke them, Rowan dipped his fingers into the bowl and marked her forehead with the ash mixture. "It is done," he said, his voice carrying an odd weight. The pack murmured their approval, though Kala caught more than a few skeptical glances. Still, it was a small victory, and she'd take it. Later that night, the atmosphere shifted. The formalities of the ritual gave way to a more relaxed gathering, with pack members laughing, sharing drinks, and exchanging stories. Kala found herself perched on a log near the fire, sipping something warm and spicy that Rowan had handed her without explanation. "You survived," Rowan said, sitting down beside her. "Barely," she replied, though a small smile tugged at her lips. "You did better than most would," he admitted. "Even if Marceline is still sharpening her claws for you." "Yeah, well, she can get in line," Kala said, her smile fading. "I'm not here to make friends." "Good," Rowan said. "Because that's not why Lucian brought you here." His words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Kala glanced at him, trying to read his expression, but as usual he gave nothing away. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Rowan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared into the fire, his amber eyes glowing faintly in the flickering light. "It means your place here isn't just about loyalty, it's about survival." The words sent a chill down her spine. "Survival from what?" Before he could answer, a low growl rumbled from somewhere behind them. Kala turned sharply, her breath catching as she saw one of the pack members, his face contorted, his muscles bulging, his body caught mid-transformation. The shift was violent, primal, and utterly horrifying. Bones cracked and reformed, claws extended, and fur rippled over his skin. "Oh my God," Kala whispered, her voice trembling. "Stay back," Rowan said sharply, stepping in front of her. The transformed wolfman snarled, his glowing eyes locking onto Kala for a brief, terrifying moment. Then, with a sharp bark from Lucian, he backed down, his massive form retreating into the shadows. Kala's legs felt like jelly as she turned to Lucian, who approached with calm authority. What the hell was that?" "That," Lucian said, his voice steady, "is the reality of this world. My world." Kala stared at him, her chest heaving. "I can't do this. I can't be part of this." "You already are," he said, his gaze unwavering, "whether you like it or not." The rest of the night passed in a blur. Kala retreated to the estate, her mind racing with everything she'd seen and heard. She wanted to leave, to run as far away from this insanity as possible. But deep down she knew there was no escape. As she sat in her room, staring out the window, there was a soft knock at the door. "Come in," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucian entered, his expression softer than usual. He didn't speak immediately, instead taking a seat across from her. "You were brave tonight," he said finally. Kala let out a bitter laugh. "I was terrified." "That's normal," he said, his voice gentle. "But you didn't back down. That matters." She turned to him, her eyes searching his face. "Why me, Lucian? Why am I here?" His gaze darkened, the weight of his answer heavy in the silence. "Because you're stronger than you realize, and because I need you." The words sent a shiver down her spine, though she couldn't tell if it was fear or something else. Before she could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. Rowan stepped inside, his expression grim. "We have a problem," he said. Lucian rose, his posture tense. "What is it?" "A rival alpha is here," Rowan said. "He's demanding a meeting." Kala's heart sank as Lucian's jaw tightened. Whatever was happening, she had a feeling it wasn't good. "Stay here," Lucian said, his voice firm as he turned to leave. Kala watched him go, her unease growing. She had no idea what kind of danger was lurking in the shadows, but one thing was clear: her life was no longer her own. Chapter 9. Kala hovered near the hallway leading to Lucian's office, her heart pounding as muffled voices reached her ears. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop. Well, not this time. But the sharp edge in Lucian's tone and the low growl of the rival alpha had her rooted to the spot. She shouldn't be here, she knew that. But her curiosity had teeth and it bit deep. "Your pack is weaker than it's ever been, Lucian," a voice rumbled, deep and laced with menace. "You can't afford to ignore the cracks forming under your rule." "I'm not ignoring anything," Lucian said, his voice low but lethal. "My pack is strong, and we honor the terms of our pact. If you've come to challenge that, tread carefully." Kala peeked around the corner, her breath catching at the sight of the rival alpha. He was tall and broad, with dark, weathered skin and golden eyes that gleamed like molten metal. There was something feral about the way he stood, his movements deliberate and coiled like a predator waiting to strike. Beside him, Lucian was the picture of control, though the tension in his jaw and the faint glow in his blue eyes betrayed the storm beneath the surface. "I didn't come here to challenge you," the rival alpha said, a smirk playing at his lips. "Not yet, anyway." His gaze flicked toward the doorway, and for a terrifying moment, Kala thought he'd spotted her. "You came here to waste my time, then," Lucian said dryly. The alpha's smirk widened. "I came to warn you. Your pack is vulnerable, and not just from the outside. Keep your house in order, Wolf, otherwise someone else will." Lucian's growl was so low and menacing it sent a chill down Kala's spine. "Leave, now." The rival alpha's smirk didn't waver as he turned and strode toward the door. Kala pressed herself against the wall, hoping to stay out of sight, but her luck ran out. Well, the alpha said, his golden eyes locking onto hers. "What's this, a human in the wolf's den?" Kala's pulse spiked, but she refused to cower. "I'm not just a human," she said, crossing her arms and forcing her voice to stay steady. "I'm part of this pack." The alpha chuckled, a low, dark sound. "Is that so? And what exactly is your role here, little human?" Kala opened her mouth, scrambling for a response, but Lucian's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "She's none of your concern," Lucian said, stepping between them. His tone was calm, but the barely restrained fury in his eyes was impossible to miss. The rival alpha's gaze lingered on Kala, his smirk deepening. "Careful, Wolf. Your attachments could be your undoing." Kala bristled. "I think you've overstayed your welcome," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. The alpha raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised, and maybe a little amused, by her boldness. "Feisty, I'll give you that." "Goodbye, Jarek," Lucian said, his voice final. Jarek turned and left without another word, his presence lingering like smoke even after the door closed behind him. Lucian rounded on Kala, his eyes blazing. "What were you thinking?" Kala straightened, refusing to shrink under his glare. "I was thinking that I'm tired of being treated like I don't belong here." "You could have been hurt," Lucian snapped, his voice rising. "Do you have any idea how dangerous he is?" Kala crossed her arms, her frustration boiling over. "I didn't exactly invite him to taunt me, Lucian, and for the record, I held my own just fine." Lucian stared at her, his jaw clenched and his eyes still glowing faintly. "This isn't a game, Kala. Jarek doesn't make idle threats. And neither do I," she shot back. "If I'm part of this pack, then I'm not going to stand on the sidelines while people like him walk all over us." Something shifted in Lucian's expression, anger giving way to something deeper, something that sent a shiver through her. "You're infuriating," he said softly. "You're welcome," she replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. For a long moment they stood there, the air between them charged and heavy. Then, to her surprise, Lucian's lips twitched into a faint smile. "You're stronger than I expected," he said, his voice low and almost admiring. "Well," she said, her cheeks flushing, "you're not exactly easy to impress," Lucian chuckled, the sound rumbling in his chest. "You'd be surprised." The encounter with Jarek had ripple effects. Word spread quickly through the pack, and by the next day Kala found herself the subject of more than a few whispers. "She stood up to Jarek," one pack member murmured, his tone equal parts disbelief and curiosity. "I heard she didn't even flinch," another said. Even Rowan, who rarely offered praise, gave her a curt nod when they crossed paths. It wasn't much, but it felt like progress. Of course, Marceline remained as frosty as ever. "Don't let the attention go to your head," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. One act of bravery doesn't make you one of us." "I don't need your approval, Marceline," Kala said, surprising herself with how steady her voice was. Marceline's icy smile didn't waver. "Good, because you'll never have it." Kala watched her walk away, her frustration bubbling under the surface. But instead of dwelling on it, she let the victory of the previous night bolster her. Later that evening, Kala found herself in the study with Lucian, the tension between them less sharp, but still present. "You're quiet," Lucian said, glancing up from the documents spread across his desk. "I'm just processing," Kala admitted, sinking into one of the chairs. "This world of yours, it's a lot." Lucian's gaze softened, and for a moment he looked less like the alpha and more like the man behind the title. "I know, it's not easy." "Why do you do it?" she asked. "Carry all of this on your shoulders?" Lucian leaned back in his chair, his expression contemplative. "Because I have to. The pack depends on me, and I won't let them down." There was a weight to his words that made her chest tighten. For all his confidence and authority, she could see the burden he carried, the sacrifices he made to protect his people. "You're not as invincible as you pretend to be," she said softly. Lucian's lips twitched, but his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "And you're not as fragile as you think." Kala held his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. It wasn't romantic, exactly, but it was raw and real, and it left her feeling more connected to him than she wanted to admit. The peace didn't last long. As the evening wore on, Rowan entered the room, his expression grim. "Jarek left a message," he said, handing Lucian a folded piece of paper. Lucian opened it, his jaw tightening as he read. "What is it?" Kala asked, her unease growing. Lucian's eyes darkened as he folded the paper and set it aside. "A warning." "About what?" "Rebellion," Lucian said simply, his tone carrying the weight of what was to come. Kala's chest tightened, the stakes of Lucian's world crashing down on her like a wave. Whatever was brewing, it was clear that she was now part of it, whether she liked it or not. Chapter 10. The tension in the estate was thick enough to cut with a knife. Kala noticed it immediately as she descended the grand staircase. The usual quiet hum of activity had been replaced by hushed whispers, sidelong glances, and the occasional low growl from a passing pack member. "What's going on?" she asked a young man with sandy hair, one of the few pack members who didn't look at her like she was an intruder. He hesitated, his gaze darting around. "You should ask the alpha," he said before scurrying away. Kala frowned. The secrecy was starting to get under her skin. She wasn't just an outsider here, she was the elephant in the room, and she hated it. "Fine," she muttered. "I'll figure it out myself." She wandered the halls aimlessly at first, hoping to stumble upon some clue, but her search took a surprising turn when she noticed a crack in one of the walls near Lucian's office. Upon closer inspection, she realized it wasn't a crack at all. It was a seam, barely visible, in what appeared to be a hidden door. "Really?" she whispered to herself. "He has a secret room? What is this, a spy movie?" Curiosity got the better of her. She pressed her fingers against the seam, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. Inside, the air was cool and heavy, tinged with the scent of old paper and something earthy. The room was lined with shelves crammed with books, scrolls, and artifacts that looked like they belonged in a museum. At the center of the room stood a table covered in maps and documents, each one scrawled with symbols and notes she couldn't decipher. "What the hell is this?" she murmured, stepping closer. A flicker of movement caught her eye, and she turned to see a large glass case containing a dagger with an ornate handle. The blade gleamed faintly in the dim light, and something about it made her shiver. "This doesn't look ominous at all," she muttered, but her voice lacked its usual bite. Before she could examine it further, a voice behind her made her jump. "What are you doing in here?" She spun around to find Lucian standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable but his eyes blazing with intensity. I got curious," she stammered, suddenly feeling like a kid caught sneaking cookies before dinner. "This room is off limits," he said, stepping closer. His tone was calm, but there was an edge to it that made her heart race. "Clearly," she said, gesturing to the hidden door. "But you can't just leave something like this lying around and not expect people to peek inside." Lucian's lips twitched, but his expression remained stern. "You shouldn't be here." Kala folded her arms, refusing to back down. "Maybe if you stopped keeping me in the dark, I wouldn't feel the need to snoop." His gaze softened, just slightly. "This isn't about keeping you in the dark. It's about keeping you safe." "That's the thing," she said, her voice rising. "I don't feel safe. I feel like I've been thrown into the middle of a storm I didn't ask for, and no one will tell me what's going on." Lucian hesitated, his jaw tightening. "This room contains the history of my pack, the laws we live by, and the truths we protect. It's not something I share lightly." "Maybe it's time you start," she said, her tone quieter now. For a long moment they stood there, the tension between them thick and charged. Finally, Lucian sighed and gestured for her to sit at the table. Over the next hour, Lucian explained more than she'd expected. He spoke of the ancient pacts that bound the werewolves, the territories they protected, and the rivalries that spanned generations. "This dagger," he said, gesturing to the weapon in the case, "is a symbol of the Alpha's authority. It's tied to the power I wield, and it's one of the reasons my enemies seek to weaken me." Kala's gaze shifted to the blade, her unease deepening. "The rival Alpha? Jarek. He's trying to take your power?" "Among other things," Lucian said, his tone grim. "And someone in your pack is helping him," she said, the realization dawning on her. Lucian's jaw tightened on her. "It's possible." Kala stared at him, the weight of his burden settling heavily in her chest. "Why are they doing this? Betraying you?" "Power," he said simply. "Ambition? Fear." She frowned. "But you're their alpha. Don't they trust you?" "Trust is a fragile thing," he said, his voice tinged with something she couldn't quite place. "Regret, perhaps? And not everyone is loyal when they see an opportunity to gain more for themselves." Her heart ached at the rawness in his tone, and she reached out before she could stop herself, placing a hand on his arm. "You're not in this alone, you know." Lucian's gaze snapped to hers, something flickering in his eyes that made her breath catch. "Kala?" Before he could finish, the sharp sound of glass shattering echoed through the estate, followed by a chorus of panicked shouts. The attack was swift and brutal. Kala barely had time to process what was happening before Lucian was on his feet, barking orders to the pack members rushing into the room. "Stay here," he told her, his voice commanding. "Like hell I will," she shouted, but he was already gone, leaving her alone in the chaos. Heart pounding, she crept out of the secret room and into the hallway, where the sound of growls and snarls sent chills down her spine. She caught a glimpse of a figure. A rogue werewolf, massive and snarling, as it lunged at one of Lucian's pack members. She ducked behind a pillar, her breath coming in short gasps. This wasn't just a scuffle. It was a war, and she was caught in the middle of it. The fight spilled into the great room, where Lucian and Jarek faced off in a clash of power and dominance. Kala could only watch, her heart in her throat, as Lucian's form shimmered with a terrifying, primal energy. His movements were swift and brutal, a testament to his strength as an alpha. But Jarek was relentless, his strikes calculated and cruel. For a moment, Kala thought Lucian might falter, but then his gaze found hers, and something in his expression shifted. With a roar that sent shivers down her spine, Lucian unleashed a final, devastating blow, sending Jarek sprawling across the room. The rogues retreated, dragging their injured leader with them. The aftermath was a blur. The pack tended to their wounded, the estate filled with the low hum of whispered conversations and tense glances. Kala found herself back in Lucian's study, her hands trembling as she tried to process what had just happened. Lucian entered, his shirt torn and bloodied but his gaze steady as he approached her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice soft. She shook her head, her throat tight. "No, but..." Lucian, this is too much. I can't do this. You can, he said firmly, his hand brushing against hers. You're stronger than you think. I'm terrified, she admitted, her voice breaking. So am I, he said, his gaze locking onto hers. But we don't have the luxury of running, Kala. Not anymore. The weight of his words settled over her, and for the first time, she realized the truth in them. She couldn't run. Not from him. Not from this. Chapter 11. The morning after the attack dawned gray and heavy, as though even the weather had decided to mourn the state of the pack. Kala woke to the sound of muffled voices outside her door. For a moment she thought about burrowing under the covers and pretending none of this was real, but reality had a way of barging in, whether she wanted it or not. She dragged herself out of bed, changed into something comfortable, well, as comfortable as she could feel in Lucian's mansion, and stepped into the hallway. The tension in the air was palpable, a weight pressing down on her chest as she made her way toward the source of the voices. In the dining room, Lucian, Rowan, and Ezekiel stood around a large table scattered with maps, papers, and what looked like surveillance photos. Their faces were grim, and the low hum of their conversation stopped the moment she entered. "Don't stop on my account," Kala said, her voice sharper than intended. She folded her arms, unwilling to let the weight of their scrutiny get to her. "I think I've earned the right to know what's going on." Lucian exchanged a glance with Rowan, who nodded slightly before stepping back. Ezekiel, who Kala had only interacted with in passing, watched her with quiet intensity, his arms crossed over his broad chest. "It wasn't Jarek," Lucian said finally, his tone clipped. "The attack last night, it came from within the pack." Kala's heart sank. "You mean someone here betrayed you?" Lucian nodded, his jaw tight. "A splinter group. They've been feeding information to Jarek and his rogues." "Well," Kala asked, her voice rising, "why would they do that?" "Because they don't believe in my leadership," Lucian said, his eyes darkening, "and because they think they can do better without me." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. Kala's gaze shifted to the table, her attention caught by one of the photos. It was blurry, but the figure in it was unmistakably familiar. "Who's that?" she asked, pointing to the photo. Lucian's hesitation was brief but noticeable. Tasha," he said finally. "One of the pack members who turned." "She's about my age," Kala said, her stomach twisting. "How does someone even get to that point?" "By losing faith," Rowan said, his voice low. "By letting doubt fester until it turns into rebellion." Kala frowned, a flicker of unease settling in her chest. "What does this have to do with me?" Lucian didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "They're not just after me," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "They're after you, too." Her stomach dropped. "Me? Why?" Lucian turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Because of your bloodline." Kala blinked. "My what?" "It's complicated," Lucian said, his tone frustratingly vague. "Then uncomplicate it," she snapped, her frustration boiling over. "I've been dragged into this mess without any explanation, and I'm done being kept in the dark. If there's something about me that makes me a target, I deserve to know." Lucian's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Rowan stepped in. "She's right," Rowan said, his voice calm but firm. "If she's going to stay here and be part of this, she needs to know the truth." Lucian sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "Fine, but not here. Ezekiel, take her to the training grounds. We'll talk after." The training grounds were tucked behind the estate, a sprawling space surrounded by dense forest. Wooden dummies, sparring mats, and various weapons were scattered throughout the area, and the faint scent of pine hung in the air. Ezekiel handed her a pair of padded gloves, his expression serious. "You're going to learn how to protect yourself," he said simply. "Great," Kala muttered, slipping on the gloves. "Because last night wasn't traumatizing enough. Your sarcasm won't help you in a fight," Ezekiel said, his voice dry but not unkind. Neither will this, she shot back, gesturing to herself. I'm not exactly built for combat. Then we'll build you, Ezekiel said, stepping back and gesturing for her to take a fighting stance. Kala hesitated but complied, feeling awkward and out of place. So, what now? Do I punch something? Not yet, he said. First, you learn balance. Without it, you're an easy target. The training was grueling, and Kala quickly realized just how out of her depth she was. But as the minutes turned into hours, she started to find a rhythm, her movements becoming more fluid and less hesitant. Rowan arrived halfway through the session, leaning against a tree with his usual air of detached observation. She's not bad, he said after watching her throw a particularly solid punch. Kala straightened, wiping sweat from her brow. I think that's the closest thing to a compliment I've ever gotten from you, Rowan smirked. Don't get used to it. Ezekiel chuckled, stepping back to give her a break. You've got potential, he said, his tone lighter now. But don't let your guard down. Your enemies won't. Kala nodded, her chest tightening with a mix of determination and unease. This was her reality now, and there was no room for hesitation. Later that evening, Kala sat across from Lucian in the study, her muscles sore but her resolve stronger than ever. Tell me the truth, she said, her voice steady. What's so special about my bloodline? Lucian hesitated, his eyes searching hers. Your family was part of the pack, he said finally. Generations ago, but they left, severing their ties with us and taking something valuable with them. Kala frowned. What kind of something? Magic, Lucian said simply. Your bloodline carries a rare magic tied to the pack's strength. That's why Jarek wants you, and why I need to protect you. Her mind raced, the weight of his words crashing down on her like a wave. You're telling me I'm some kind of key to your survival? Yes, Lucian said, his voice quiet but firm. Kala stared at him, her chest tightening. And you didn't think to tell me this sooner? I didn't want to overwhelm you, he said. She laughed bitterly. Well, congratulations. Mission not accomplished. Lucian stepped closer, his gaze softening. Kala, I know this is a lot, but you're not in this alone. I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe. The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, and for a moment, she didn't know what to say. You'd better, she said finally, her voice quieter now. Because if I go down, I'm taking you with me. Lucian chuckled softly, the tension between them easing just slightly. Fair enough. But as they stood there, the weight of their situation settled heavily between them, a reminder that the battle was far from over. Chapter 12. Kala stood in the middle of the estate's grand library, staring at the crackling fire in the massive hearth. Despite its warmth, her insides felt cold. The weight of Lucian's revelations the night before pressed on her like a lead blanket. Her bloodline carried a rare magic tied to the pack's survival. Jarek wanted her as leverage. Lucian needed her to maintain his strength. And the pack? They barely tolerated her. No pressure or anything, she thought bitterly. She'd spent the morning trying to process everything, but the more she tried to make sense of it, the more impossible it felt. The sound of footsteps behind her made her tense. She turned to see Marceline entering the room, her sharp gaze narrowing as it landed on Kala. Should have known I'd find you here, Marceline said, her voice dripping with disdain. Looking for an escape in books, are we? Kala crossed her arms. What do you want, Marceline? The blonde approached, her movements graceful but predatory. I want to know what you're still doing here. Kala raised an eyebrow. Oh, you mean besides being tied to this whole mess by my so-called magical bloodline? Not much, just enjoying the hospitality. Marceline's lips curled into a frosty smile. You think this is funny? Do you have any idea what your presence here has cost us? Kala bristled. Excuse me? Last I checked, I didn't ask to be dragged into your supernatural soap opera. No, Marceline said sharply. But now that you're here, we're all paying the price. The pack is divided, Lucian is distracted, and Jarek's rogues are circling like vultures waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Kala's stomach twisted, but she refused to let Marceline see her falter. "And you think this is my fault?" Marceline stepped closer, her eyes cold and piercing. "You are a liability, Kala. A weakness Lucian can't afford. If you care about this pack, if you care about him, you'll leave." The words hit like a punch to the gut, but Kala forced herself to hold her ground. "You think running away will fix this? Newsflash, Jarek's not going to stop just because I'm not here. If anything, it'll make me an even bigger target." Marceline's jaw tightened, but her expression didn't soften. "At least then you'd be out of our way." "Wow," Kala said, her voice trembling with anger. "And here I thought we were bonding." Marceline's frosty smile returned. "Consider this friendly advice. You don't belong here, Kala. You never will." With that, she turned and left, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Kala sank into one of the library's armchairs, her chest heaving. Marceline's words echoed in her mind, a relentless drumbeat of doubt and fear. Maybe Marceline was right. Maybe she didn't belong here. But as the fire crackled and the tension in her chest ebbed slightly, another thought took root. Marceline didn't know her. None of them did. And if they thought she was going to roll over and let them decide her fate, they had another thing coming. Later that evening, Lucian found her in the garden. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the manicured hedges and flower beds. Kala stood near a stone fountain, her arms crossed as she stared into the rippling water. "You've been avoiding me," Lucian said, his deep voice breaking the silence. Kala didn't turn to face him. "Can you blame me?" He stepped closer, his presence a quiet force. "You're angry." "Gee, what gave it away?" she said, her voice tinged with sarcasm. Lucian sighed, his hands sliding into his pockets. "I know this isn't what you wanted, Kala, and I know it's not fair." She finally turned to face him, her eyes blazing. "Fair? Lucian, my entire life has been turned upside down because of you and your pack, and now on top of everything else I'm supposed to just accept that I'm some kind of magical battery for your alpha powers?" "It's not like that," he said, his voice low but firm. "You're more than that. More than just your bloodline." "Am I?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "Because right now it feels like that's the only reason anyone here even tolerates me." Lucian's gaze softened, and he stepped closer, his presence steady and grounding. "I know this is hard, and I know I haven't made it easier, but you're not just here because of your bloodline, Kala. You're here because you're strong, because you matter." She stared at him, her chest tight. "Do I? Or am I just another piece on your chessboard?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment he didn't answer. Then he reached out, his hand brushing against hers. "You're not a pawn, Kala. You're my partner, my equal." Her breath hitched at the raw sincerity in his voice, but before she could respond he stepped back, his expression growing serious. "I won't force you to stay," he said quietly. "If you want to leave, I'll make sure you're protected. But if you choose to stay, it won't be easy. This life comes with sacrifices, and you'll have to face them head on." "And if I stay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then we fight together," he said simply. "For the pack. For each other." The weight of his words settled over her, and for the first time she felt the gravity of her choice. That night, Kala sat in her room, staring out the window at the moonlit garden. Marceline's harsh words echoed in her mind, mingling with Lucian's quiet promises. She thought of everything she'd faced since coming here. The fear, the doubt, the moments of clarity and strength she hadn't known she possessed. Running would be easy, safe. But staying? That was something else entirely. Her jaw set, and she rose to her feet, determination flooding her veins. The next morning, Kala found Lucian in the study. He looked up from his desk as she entered, his expression unreadable. "I'm staying," she said, her voice steady. Lucian rose, his eyes locking onto hers. On my terms? No, she said firmly. On mine. His lips twitched into a faint smile, a glimmer of admiration in his gaze. Fair enough. But even as they stood there, a quiet understanding settling between them, Kala knew this was only the beginning. Thank you for joining us on this thrilling journey so far. But trust me, the story is far from over. The twists, the revelations, and the emotions are only just beginning to unravel. You don't want to miss what happens next. It's where the narrative truly comes alive. Continue this adventure seamlessly by heading to the next part of the audiobook, where the story deepens and the stakes get even higher. Click the link in the description to dive straight in. Don't wait, your next chapter awaits, and you won't want to miss a single moment of it.